So I'm just going to be speaking about some of the citrus diseases that can impact your plants in your home garden that we have in Australia, or some of the disease threats that we have that we don't want to come in from overseas. Because you put so much time and effort into your plants in your garden that if you don't start off with a disease-free plant at the start, all that energy is wasted. So I am, as Jessica said, I work with New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, and I'm based at, oh, I've got to accept the recording first. And I'm based at Elizabeth Macarthur Agricultural Institute. So for those who don't know, that's in southwest Sydney. It's between Camden and Menangle, and it's a biosecurity centre. So I work with a small team of experienced scientists, and we work on prevention, detection, eradication, and management of citrus diseases. So those diseases that we have in the country already, endemic diseases, also called established diseases. And we also work on diseases that are exotic, so that we don't know that they're here yet. We're trying to prevent their entry into the country. So just to start with, some disease symptoms are really obvious. So just a couple of examples there. There's a fungal disease called mouse secco. Now, when you see dieback on your citrus trees, a lot of the time it isn't a disease that's the primary cause of the dieback. Sometimes fungi or bacteria, they're called saprophytes, they can invade dying tissue, and they can be what we call a secondary invader. But most of the time, they're not the primary cause. But there are some pathogens that can cause dieback on their own. And if that's the case, you can see other signs, and they're quite obvious. So you can see on mouse secco those little black dots, they're like tiny poppy seeds. And then there's other diseases like citrus canker, where you can see ugly lesions. So there's bacterial lesions, and they're covered with a black water-soaked margin. They're surrounded. So there are diseases that are less obvious. And particularly in a nursery plant or in a bud stick, you don't know that it's even infected. And those pathogens, they're systemic. So that means they're inside the vascular tissue. They could be in the water xylem tubes or the food, the phloem tubes that carry nutrients around the plant. And we refer to these as graft transmissible diseases. So yes, they can be spread by grafting, or by infected budwood or rootstock seed. So as you know, citrus, the varieties we like to eat, don't always grow so well on their own roots. So we start off with a rootstock variety, which is a very hardy variety. You wouldn't want to eat the fruit, but the rootstocks are hardy. We grow those rootstock seedlings from seed, and then we get the bud of the citrus variety that we want to grow and bud that onto the rootstock. And so you want to make sure that, so that's one way to transmit these graft transmissible diseases, is through if the bud is infected or if the seed is infected. Also mechanical transmission on cutting tools like secateurs, the grafting knife, the budding knife that you use, or the big pruning shears. There can also be root grafting under the ground. So if you've got two citrus trees that are close to each other in your garden, their root systems will often intertwine, and there can be grafting. If you get the connection of the vascular tissue between the two roots, whatever pathogens are in one tree can spread to the other tree. And there can also be vectors. These could be insects or mites. Now, we're lucky for citrus. The only graft transmissible disease that has an insect vector is citrus tristeza virus that's spread by aphids. But some of the really nasty diseases that we're trying to keep out, they are spread by insect vectors. Some of those vectors are already here and some of them aren't, but we could always have a native insect that could spread that. So graft transmissible diseases, they might do not much to the plant, or they might have a severe impact. So from mild, moderate, severe stunting, they can reduce yield, they can reduce quality, they can make your fruit taste horrible, and they can cause tree death. So there's a range of different symptoms. And the sticking point, it can be very complex. So symptoms may only be seen in some varieties, but there are symptomless varieties that can be carriers that could spread through the cutting tools, through the insect vector, through root grafting. Or if you graft onto a different rootstock. So there might be one rootstock that's quite tolerant, and it doesn't matter that the bud is infected. You take a bud from that tree, put that onto a different rootstock, and there can be a significant impact if that rootstock variety is susceptible. Can be worse in combination as well. There are a number of these pathogens that on their own they don't do much, but if you get more than one in there, there can be a synergistic effect, we call it. So it makes it worse. It increases the severity of the impact on the plant. Symptom development can be delayed for years, so you can put a lot of time and effort into a tree, and then after 6-7 years you say, why isn't it fruiting, or why does the fruit taste horrible, or why is the bark peeling off? And you realise you've wasted all this effort on an infected tree. So as I said before, tree decline or death can occur, or you just get not much fruit and it could be poor quality. And there's no cure, you just have to remove the tree. So just a little bit of history, I thought it may be of interest. So back in the early 1900s, the nurseries that were growing citrus trees for people's backyards or for orchards, their trees that they were cutting the buds for, they weren't checked for disease or even for trueness to type, because as we know, there can be mutations with citrus. So they started the Cooperative Bud Selection Society in 1928, and they started selecting from trees that looked healthy. In the 1940s, there was widespread death of trees, and that was due to Phytophthora on sweet orange and rough lemon rootstock varieties. So they started using citrus trifoliata rootstocks. A lot of people would have heard of tri rootstocks, and so they are sort of resistant to Phytophthora. And then we started getting issues with Citrus exocortis viroid. Now I'll talk about viroids a little bit. They behave similar to viruses, but they're like tiny naked viruses. They're just a bit of nucleic acid that floats around the plant. They don't have the protein coat that viruses have. So they're much smaller in the number of genes that make them up are much smaller. So they're tiny naked viruses is what I call them, but just think of them in the same way, but they can be very destructive. And so this was causing widespread issues on trifoliata rootstock, which is a susceptible rootstock. So they realised that just because the tree looked healthy doesn't mean it had something in it. When you put that onto a different rootstock, then they were getting disease. So they started in 1953, the Parent Tree Registration Scheme, and that has evolved to become the Oz Citrus Propagation Scheme. So it just shows diseases can really impact an industry and what you're able to grow in your garden. So that leads me to how we manage those graft transmissible diseases today. What are we doing right now? And we've got great border protection and post-entry quarantine for imported citrus varieties. So as you know, you can't just bring a bud stick of a new citrus variety into the country in your suitcase. It has to be imported with an import permit, and it goes through post-entry quarantine. It goes through a process that I'll speak about in a minute, and then it undergoes testing. We've also got distinct border protection, not just the Australian border, but for the state borders, because of some diseases that are limited to certain areas, which I'll go into in a minute as well. We've got the National Citrus Repository Program. So those imported varieties that go through post-entry quarantine, they do the testing, we eliminate pathogens by shoot tip grafting, and then they retest. And if no pathogens are detected, then that becomes the foundation tree or the mother tree for that variety. It's the highest health status tree of that variety in the country. It's put into a national citrus repository. Now for Australian varieties, so there's a new variety that someone wants to commercialise. That work is also done, the same process, but that's done here at EMAI. We do that work, whereas the post-entry quarantine is done by the federal government. And those foundation trees are maintained. We've got duplicate repository houses, one here at EMAI and one down at the Oz Citrus property at Dareton. And then buds are taken from those trees, and they may be sent to the private variety owner if it's a private variety. If it's a public variety, then that doesn't go, that pathway doesn't apply. But for all the varieties, buds are then propagated. It's rapid nursery multiplication, and those are the trees that are used to supply the nurseries. So nurseries put in budwood orders, and then the Oz Citrus Propagation Scheme sends those buds out to the people who ordered them. And so this is just a drone view of their property. So they do have budwood source trees that are out in the open, which means they're exposed if we get a new disease. But they're building up the number of trees that they have in a protected environment, just in case a new disease comes into the area. And these trees are tested. We do the testing here at EMAI. They're tested for 8 different viroids and, well, essentially 5 different viruses that we have in this country. Don't worry about what they're called at this stage. It's more just to give you a list to say, yes, there's quite a few risks that you could be facing if you are growing citrus. Now, the shoot dip grafting, the pathogen elimination that I mentioned earlier, it's a form of micrografting, and it's the only way to remove a virus or a viroid from a citrus variety. So we grow rootstocks from seed in a tube in the dark so that it grows up straight, searching for the light, and then we take the infected mother tree and take tiny shoots off those, and under a dissecting microscope we peel away until we get that apical tip that's about 0.1 millimeters, and then we graft that under the microscope into the rootstock, and then that grows, and it's a numbers game. You could do 50 and there may only be 1 or 2 or none where you've removed the pathogen. The idea is that the pathogen particles may not have moved into that tiny apical tip, and the problem with some viruses is they accumulate in that little tip, so they're very difficult to get rid of. There are a number of different programs that are associated to support the Oz Citrus scheme. So there's a fairly new project that Oz Citrus leads, but it's Citrus Australia. So Jess has a big involvement in this project, as well as New South Wales DPI. And that's trying to reduce the smuggling risk to make sure that we have varieties that may not be a massive commercial option, but they have cultural significance, so there is some demand for them, making sure we have a clean source, a disease-free source of those for people to use in their garden. Now, this is to try to reduce the temptation to smuggle those varieties into the country. We also have a project to make sure that, I mentioned that we're testing these the foundation trees and the budwood supply trees that Oz Citrus use, and we're just making sure that we are using the best detection methods available. So we run a project from EMAI looking at different published methods and developing new methods, so improved methods of detection. And we not only use these methods for testing the Oz Citrus trees, but also for testing any suspect samples that might come through, that people think it might be a disease, any diagnostic samples, any surveillance samples that might be coming through. And we use them to test the samples that were sent through the Citrus Watch program. So what are some of the threats, just to show you what they might be? So the threats that we already have here, it's that big list. I'm just going to mention a couple of them. So Exocortis viroid, just to show you it can reduce your yield by up to 50% on citrange rootstocks and by up to 65% on trifoliata rootstocks. So you'll just be wasting your time and effort. You're not going to get as much fruit off your tree. And when you think about it, Oz Citrus only adds 60 cents to the cost of producing a nursery tree. So it really is worth it. The trees are much smaller. You see in the photo on the bottom. So this was an orchard where they bought trees from 2 different nurseries. And then they planted them out in the orchard, and several years later, after they'd spent about $30,000 per hectare on this orchard in establishing it, and then the maintenance of that each year, and half the trees were infected with Excortus viride because that nursery that those trees came from, they hadn't used Oz citrus budwood. And because of the potential for root grafting, the entire orchard had to be removed. Another virus, and this is citrus tristeza virus, CTV, that's the one that's spread by aphids. There's hundreds of different variants. So I think I had on the slide about the diagnostic methods that we're dealing with about 53 different graft transmissible pathogens that we're looking at. 36 of those we don't have in the country. But within those, there are many different variants or strains that can have many different impacts on the plant. And CTV is a good example of that. There can be stunting, reduced yield, lopsided, funny tasting fruit, and stem pitting. So the photo on the bottom, that's grapefruit stem pitting. And all those citrus buds are actually sold with a mild strain of citrus tristeza virus to protect against grapefruit stem pitting. And then there's orange stem pitting that's only thought to, that's the top photo that is only recorded to occur in Queensland, and it has results in fine pitting, not the big pits for grapefruit. It's even worse. It's more destructive. It's fine pits and gum that lead to brittle twigs and branches. There's reduced tree growth, fruit size and production, and that is why we've got some domestic quarantine. So I was mentioning that there's different quarantine levels. So there's the country and then there's the states. So it's illegal to move citrus plant material from Queensland to other states of Australia. Not just New South Wales, but other states as well. So mandarins are symptomless carriers. So the mandarin industry in Queensland, the trees could be carrying orange stem pitting, but it's not impacting their industry, so they don't know. But you cannot grow oranges successfully in Queensland when this virus is around. It resulted in changes in other countries where they had to change to a mandarin industry from an orange industry. Like Peru, all the orange trees were decimated, so they became a mandarin growing country. So we really don't want that to spread down to our southern orange growing areas. And just a couple of exotic threats. One being HLB that you would have heard of. That's very important for the Citrus Watch program and the Early Detector Network. So HLB decimates trees, and it can take years for symptoms to be seen. It does depend on the environment and how well the trees are looked after. And the issue is you'll get reduced size and lopsided fruit, reduced fruit production, and it tastes terrible. So in Florida, they didn't notice it in the juice for a while because the bitter juice was diluted by the okay tasting juice. Personally, I've never liked Florida juice, but compared to Australian juice, but they didn't notice it as much. But then the bitter juice, the percentage of bitter juice increased to the point that you could taste it. The symptoms, you probably already know this, that you look out for is the asymmetric blotchy mottle, so the different pattern on each side of the midrib of the leaf. But it can just look like nutrient deficiency symptoms, and it can look like that picture down on the bottom left, which is a green island symptom, which you can also see. I have seen it in gardens in Australia with spray injury, so herbicide damage. And it's spread by the Asian citrus psyllid, which on its own, it just causes that bit of pinching that you see in that top photo. But it's destructive because of what it carries. And you'll see in that bottom right-hand photo, just to give you a bit of an idea of the perspective of the size. So it can be really hard to spot at first, but then you get your eye in if you're in a country that has the psyllid. And to show you the other strain, there's a few different strains of bacteria that cause HLB. The most common and the biggest threat to us, as you can see from the distribution maps, is Asiaticus, the Asian strain. And it's right in the countries in our northern border. And look, I've done surveillance in the Torres Strait, which is technically part of Queensland, but people do move between Papua New Guinea and the Torres Strait Islands, and between the Torres Strait Islands and the mainland of Australia quite frequently. And the PNG and Torres Strait travel is often by these boats that you see there. They're not that large. That's how close it is. So that top photo, you might be able to see on the horizon the land. That's PNG, and I'm standing on the northernmost Torres Strait island, Boigu Island. So it's pretty close. But they are very biosecure aware, and the Northern Australian Quarantine Strategy, run by the federal government, does surveillance in this region. They've got great relationships up there and a great program to protect Australia. And just to show you the impact of HLB and how quickly it can spread, detected in 2005, and by 2008, they estimate that every orchard was infected. Production's dropped significantly, and the cost of production has doubled. And that's a really big sticking point for Australia, because our cost of production is already high. It would make the industry no longer viable. So if you want to be able to grow citrus in Australia, either as a grower or in your backyard, we want to keep out HLB. But the biggest threat to Australian horticulture is actually Xylella, Xylella. It's not Z. Xylella fastidiosus, subspecies pauca, causes citrus variegated chlorosis, also called CVC. Now, it sounds like a mouthful. Just remember CVC. And we don't have that in Australia, but we probably have an insect vector that could spread it already. It's not the biggest threat to Australian citrus, but it is in our top 5. We've also got leprosis virus. It's not graft transmissible. It's not a systemic infection. It infects wherever the mite injects the virus, but we have those mites in Australia already. So all it will take is the leprosis virus to enter. And I'll just quickly say citrus canker, I mention it, it's not graft transmissible, but I mention it because it could be brought in. It's often present when material is smuggled in, and we have had so many different incursions of this bacterial disease that have all been eradicated. The most recent that you may remember was in the Northern Territory in Western Australia in 2018. And there's Malseco, which is a risk from Mediterranean and Middle Eastern countries, and it decimates particularly lemon and lime trees. So yes, I mentioned before, you can see the tiny black poppy seeds on the outside, but if it's in an early stage of infection, it would just look like a bud stick. So it's not just graft transmissibles that could be imported in material, smuggled material. You may not have seen that dieback yet. The fungal spores may still be inside that tissue.
Nerida, we just have a question come through. Do you mind if I read that out now?
No, that's fine. Sorry, I meant to ask if anyone had questions.
So one of our participants, Carl, volunteers for a project on, I'm going to try and say this, Pezzothrips kellianus, a pest that is a pest native to Australia. Is there much risk that Pezzothrips kellianus can spread to PNG via these small boats, and does it pose much threat to the agricultural production in PNG?
I wouldn't have any clue. I would have to Google that. Yeah, I'm not an entomologist, so I haven't even heard of that species. I'm sorry. But,
perhaps we can take that on notice for future Citrus Watch communications. We can have a little look into that.
Yeah, no, that's really good.
There's certainly a lot of boats in the Torres Strait, though, moving between PNG and the islands.
Yes, there is. So it's a really good point, but I can't answer that question. I'm sorry. No other questions from people? Just wondering.
No, not yet. If anyone has a question, feel free to put it in the chat or raise your virtual hand and you can call it out.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so we get to the what do you need to do to ensure that the effort you're putting into your garden is worth it? You need to know what's in your budwood. It's really important. So ask your nursery if they used Oz Citrus buds, or if they used Oz Citrus rootstock seed. There's not so many viruses that are spread by seed, and they're spread at a very low rate. So the key part is the buds. But most nurseries buy rootstock seed anyway, because it's not worth their while to have their own rootstock seed trees. But sometimes they don't all use Oz Citrus buds. And it's not mandatory to use those citrus buds in Australia, but every country that has gotten HLB, very quickly they make their budwood scheme mandatory. But if we ask the nurseries, if growers and the community ask the nurseries, have you used Oz citrus buds, it will force the nurseries to buy Oz citrus buds, to invest in that, and we'll be flooding the country with healthy citrus. Use clean cutting tools. So it's an important point that ethanol, using alcohol, doesn't kill these viroids. So you need to disinfect your cutting tools between each tree using bleach, using sodium hypochlorite solution. Now, it might sound like a strange number, 1.25%. It's got to be above 1%. Any higher than 2%, then you'll rust your tools, and it is a good idea after you dip your tools and let it stay on there for a while to then rinse your tools so that they don't get rusty, because bleach isn't very good for your tools, but it's very good at killing the risks to your plant. You need to replace that bleach solution every few hours. It breaks down in the light, and that's why we use a bucket that isn't clear, and that's what we have the secateurs in there. The reason we say 1.25% is because commercial bleach is 12.5% typically. But just check the bleach source that you're buying and check what percentage, and make sure you make it up to roughly 1.25% of sodium hypochlorite. And if you see anything unusual, if you see any unusual symptoms, report them. There's an exotic plant pest hotline that actually goes through to someone who they have enough knowledge to triage, to look through and maybe give you some immediate feedback, or they will forward that to someone like me, or an entomologist who works on insects and mites. And I get emails, a couple of emails every week from people who've contacted the exotic plant pest line and said, look, I've seen this, what do you think it is? And sometimes we can reply immediately and say, no, that's fine. Other times we might give you a call. If we're worried enough, we'll call you directly. That happened the other week. I saw the photo and immediately rang the person, and within 30 seconds of questions, I was able to determine that it wasn't what we were worried about, and but we thanked them. It was very good that they'd phoned in. So that just comes to the point of, it is everyone's responsibility to keep our citrus healthy. And are there any questions now?
None in the chat, Nerida.
Okay.
So is that your last slide?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm just going to put my video back on. Yeah, so there's some great tips there. Look, when it comes down to it, and I know some people have trouble growing good citrus in their yards, and I visit a lot of them, and I get a lot of questions when I'm out and about. And sometimes you can give it all the care in the world, but if you're not giving your citrus a good start in life by making sure that it's from high health material, you're not going to have much luck. So that's really the foundational element of growing a good citrus tree. I'm sure you agree, Nerida.
Yes.
So I've taken some, and maybe if people want to ask questions, have a think now, but some take homes from that is, ask a question of your retail nursery where you're buying your citrus. Sometimes a retail nursery will buy their citrus trees from what's called a production nursery, and that production nursery will be the ones buying Oz citrus material and then grafting the material themselves to produce the tree. But you'll be able to look at the plant and actually look at the label on the plant and find out what production nursery the citrus has come from. And if the retail nursery can't tell you if they're using Oz citrus material, you can usually do a quick Google and find out if that production nursery is. So if you're spending $50 on a tree, maybe sometimes these trees aren't cheap, so you want to make sure that it's a really good quality tree. And then the second one was sodium hypochlorite. If you're pruning multiple citrus trees in your yard, just make sure you clean your tools between the pruning. That's at 1.25%. And the third one is, if you see something strange, call the biosecurity hotline and they can help you out. I did have a question that's probably not related to graft transmissible diseases, Nerida, but I have had questions when out and about Phytophthora, which you did mention as being, I think you said that it was fairly abundant in the 50s and 60s. I was just wondering if we know much about Phytophthora that affects citrus, and how widespread is it across Australia, and what kind of symptoms would you get from that? I'm not sure if there's much known or not.
Yeah, there's a lot known. There are Phytophthora specialists that are pathologists who specialise in this, and it depends on where you are, so what your climate is, what your areas like, what soil types like, as to what species would be affecting your tree, but it doesn't really matter what species it is. The key elements are the same. So it could cause root rot, or it could cause a collar rot, where you see sort of a breakdown of the tissue at the base of the tree where the soil level is, and that bottom stump. Sometimes a tree can recover, like in really wet seasons, because if Phytophthora spores move in water, in really wet seasons, you can get a bit of an issue with Phytophthora. But if it dries up, the tree can often heal. I don't see it much in orchards because, as I said, the trifoliata rootstock is resistant. And then there are citrange rootstocks, which are incredibly popular in Australian orchards. And tri is one of the parents of the different citrange rootstocks. And so it has conferred some tolerance to those rootstocks. So under ideal conditions, you're not going to see a problem with Phytophthora. But with most pathogens, if the tree isn't very healthy, if there's an abundance of that pathogen, if the environment is favouring the pathogen over the tree, then you can get what we call super inoculation, and the resistance or the tolerance can be overcome by the pathogen, and the tree can get sick.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, it's that's a good rundown and answered a few questions for me. We do have a question in the chat from Sia. I hope I said that correctly. Hi, I'm from the NT growing pomelo. We've been through citrus canker twice in the last 30 years. Question is, monsoonal winds, so occurring from November to March from Asia, do they risk bringing in the vector or the disease on these winds, such as HLB and CTV?
Yeah, they do risk bringing in the psyllid. Yes, there was some work done looking at the different pathways of cyclones and so forth, and how that comes into the country. I'm not across all of it, but yes, your answer to your question is yes, it's a risk. And you bring up CTV, which is a really important point, because we have CTV across Australia, but there are a lot of exotic variants that we don't have. So there is a variant of CTV that can cause stem pitting in mandarins that has never been reported in Australia. And so it's really important that even if we have that virus or virus in the country, we want to keep that virus out. We still want to make sure that anything that's imported through post-entry quarantine still doesn't have those viruses in case they contain exotic strains. So we don't want to test and go, oh, it's got citrus tristeza virus. That's fine because we have that in Australia. But we want to make sure that we just keep it out in case it's exotic, or on its own it may not do much, but in combination with our variants, it can be more destructive.
Thanks, Nerida. Are there any other questions for Nerida while we have her on the line? It's a great opportunity to ask a question of a citrus pathologist, particularly if you're having a bit of trouble with the citrus in your garden. If there are no other questions, we'll leave it there, but I'll give everyone a few seconds to think up any questions they might have. No. All right. Well, thank you so much, Nerida, for your time and your amazing experience and knowledge. We greatly appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining us. Hopefully that gave you a bit of insight into citrus diseases and perhaps why your tree might not be doing so well, and hope to see you next time. We'll probably hold another webinar next autumn in a few months' time. So thanks all. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.